But now, because you bundle everything in together, you need to have broad compromises that works in Greece and works in Finland and Ireland and Poland. Then, you're taking a lot of the edge off. You're taking a lot of these like try and error. If you have to make a compromise, it takes forever to do it, and you always end up with the lowest common denominator. Never going, reaching for the stars. Never having a moon program or having something that can set the bar higher.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nomad Capitalist live from the beautiful Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. This is Javier, the tax terminator, and today I'm joined by Anders Vistisen. He is our most distinguished guest. Mr. Vistisen, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me on.
No, it's a pleasure. So we're going to be discussing a series of topics mainly centered around Europe, Europe's position in the world, its future in this increasingly uncertain geopolitical situation that the world is facing, and we have a premium guest for that. So for maybe our viewers in the United States and Canada who are maybe not entirely aware of who you are exactly, could you give us a brief presentation? You're from Denmark, you're involved in politics. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm a member of the European Parliament. I was actually elected as the youngest member in 2014.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Serving my third term now, and I act as the chief whip for the third largest delegation in the European Parliament, called the Patriots for Europe grouping, and we consist of 85 members from all across Europe, and we now consist the main opposition to Ursula von der Leyen and her Commission in the European Parliament.
Okay, interesting. What drove you to, get involved in politics initially?
I think for me, personally, I think it's something that is quite widespread now in Europe, but that was a concern over the level of illegal migration we saw to the continent, but also a question about what I think in America sometimes is defined as states' rights against the federal level, but Europe namely is a question about how much should be left to the national states of Europe and how much should be decided on a supranational level in the European Union.
You touched on two very interesting topics. So let's say the federalist point of view, obviously understanding that for everyone back home, the European Union is not a federal nation, but I like the analogy, right? Because you have a powerful supranational organization, then each individual state, in theory, right, has to retain its sovereignty. So my number one question related to that in this instance would be, do you believe the individual sovereignty of European states has been weakened or is threatened by the current trajectory of the European Union?
In certain ways, actually, today the European Union have more power than the federal states in America, of course, in certain topics. So compared, you can already now say that states in the US have, in certain areas, more freedom to act independently than we do as European nations. I think it's a bad thing. I think that the national state is the most logical place to have democratic involvement, and I think the best case for that in Europe is that we don't even speak the same language, share the same language. When I have this grouping of 85 colleagues that I share a broad sort of ideological trend with, there are certain of them I cannot even talk to without an interpreter because they simply do not speak English and I do not speak Croatian or Spanish or whatever.
Of course, no, I completely understand. And so you mentioned the comparison with US states, that in certain areas US states can act more independently vis-a-vis the federal government than certain European nation states, like full sovereign nations, can act independently vis-a-vis the European Union. What are the main areas where you see this most evidently?
I think for us right now, for instance, let's take an area where I know that the US, from my visits there is a good competition between the states. That's an area like taxation. You can attract businesses in a state if you have a progressive tax policy. We've seen, I think, Texas a good example in the US, attracting a lot of business from California, from surrounding states.
Just like Florida from New York. And
I think you would know the details way better than I would. In the European Union now, we have a legal framework that prevent us from having that kind of competition. So basically, you can see if we take the time since the millennia up to now, when around 2000, if we saw the economical power of the European Union and USA, they were about equal in size, roughly equal in size. Today, the United States is almost double in economical prosperity than we are in Europe.
As measured by GDP per capita?
GDP.
The total economic output.
Output. And that is quite a relative decline of Europe in 25 years.
I see.
And I think one of the reasons for that is that we have grown, we are not competing. we become complacent. We regulate a lot more. We have not attracted any of these new businesses that have been very important in the U.S. growth. So big tech, for one, alternative
You don't really see that many big tech European companies. I think I can think of one in Germany, which is SaaS, but then they're a business-to-business company, so they don't really impact consumers. But it's true, you don't see, I mean, and again, leave comments if you find any examples, but it's true now that you mentioned this and I'm thinking of it, you don't really see a European version of Apple or a European version of like a super AI startup. It's quite rare.
And the few that have been sort of at startup level, they have very rapidly been bought by American companies and then moved more or less the activity to Silicon Valley or equivalent places in the US.
Of course. And I've also seen, for example, spending a lot of time in the United States myself, I see a lot of European entrepreneurs go to the United States to start their business there. So even if they are European, they choose to headquarter their business in the US.
There's of course two things. There can be a positive attraction, you want to go there, go big and so on. But of course there's also what we could call a push factor in the sense that, I think it was Reagan who had this saying about a big government that firstly regulate, if it continues to regulate, you tax, and when you stop tax, you subsidize or something like that. That's basically the way, in a sense, the world works today. America innovates, China copies, and Europe regulate. It's not so strange for me that Europe is falling behind, but it has severe consequences for the continent.
All right. And so, for example, when you talk to your colleagues in the European Parliament and in your vision as a politician, what policies could help push Europe forward? What policies can help reignite that European spark? Because obviously the United States has been dominant for a while, but if I look back, 100 plus years, Europe was the center of economic activity. Europe has been at the forefront of innovation, industrialization, global trade. France and the UK were tremendous empires, Still, in my grandmother's time, Europe was very relevant from a geopolitical and economic perspective. And when it comes to me, having been born in the 90s, Europe has been more like a historical reference, but no longer the relevant power.
But I think you touched on something very important there, that it's been a very rapid decline. Basically going into the First World War, you could say that at least two of the most dominating powers in the world were based on the European continent. After the First World War, America stood back as the sort of only, of course, there was other predominant. They were the one getting out of that, politically speaking, in the best way, right? And after the Second World War, we saw the complete decline of Europe. Of course, most of the fighting happened over there and so on. But it's not only that. It's also, as I said, a question of the mindset. In the old days, you had these rivaling powers for good and for bad. Sometimes they went to war. That was not so good.
Exactly. We don't like war.
We prefer France and Germany not to do that, and so on. But if you talk about competition, we lack the fundamental part. That one of the reasons that we had the Industrial Revolution going on in the UK and that inspired other countries was that we could see that, they caught on to something, we better copy that, right? Exactly. So that was, I think, a healthy competition. And that is how I think Europe evolved and became very dominant in, let's say, the 1800s. That we had to compete with each other and therefore we got ahead of the rest of the world because you didn't have that situation. But now, because you bundle everything in together, you need to have broad compromises that works in Greece and works in Finland and Ireland and Poland, then you're taking a lot of the edge off. You're taking a lot of these like try and error. Yeah. Of course, something doesn't work and then you just abandon it. But if you have to make a compromise, it takes forever to do it, and you always end up with the lowest common denominator. Never going, reaching for the stars. Never having a moon program or having something that can set the bar higher.
Yeah, no, something major, definitely. And so, for example, something I hear a lot, and it's something that I mentioned a few moments ago, is the fact that starting a business in Europe is complicated. Like if you're a young guy in Europe and you have the next big idea, like I mentioned to you a few moments ago, most often I'll find you in Miami or Austin, Texas, or historically speaking in Silicon Valley. But very rarely do I see a European entrepreneur want to start their business in Europe. Do you think that there are certain sectors that are exceptions to this? Or do you think just young entrepreneurs are just regulated out of being able to enter the market?
There are certain barriers. One barrier is the digitalization. There is some European countries who are quite far along. Estonia, actually. Denmark is actually also going quite well. But for instance, a big country like Germany, where we fought the Wirtschaftswunder, the big reconstruction after they lost the Second World War, they are stuck. They still, when they had the COVID crisis, doctors still had to report the test results on a fax machine.
On a fax machine?
On a fax machine.
In 2020?
In 2020, 2021. And even in Denmark, we're next door neighbors, you know, and we share a border. We've also been to war historically, but you know, for a Danish person thinking, you don't have an email to the federal health authorities when you have to report these things. No, we're faxing it back and forth. You know, that says something. If you're a young entrepreneur, I think you expect a little bit different standard. But I think one of the biggest problem is that if you have a good startup and you want to enlarge with capital, if you want to go into a capital market, find financiation to take the next step from being 1-2 person in a garage, you know, thinking about Amazon and taking off, then it's very difficult in Europe because the American capital market works much better. And I think that's down to 2 things. One thing is that there the America have an advantage in size. You know, it's a big capital economy, so that you don't have this fractured market with, you know, all these different entities. That's the one thing. And I think the other thing again is regulation. You know, when the financial crisis hit, America regulated and we regulated that plus 50%. Then we had the first Trump administration deregulating a bit of this in the US, but in Europe we just continue to regulate. So it's very difficult in Europe to get this like risk capital that you need if you are an entrepreneur to go from nothing to a big thing.
Sometimes I see that the big capital that is still in Europe, because we have to acknowledge that there's still big capital in Europe, sometimes is a bit more conservative. I see European investors focus more on preservation. American investors are sometimes or oftentimes more comfortable with risk. So that's also something I sometimes identify.
Yeah, but I think to add on to that, the crazy thing is that when we take risk, we often do it in America. So Trump, he has these charts, you know, we want to put tariffs on this and that because of this and that. But actually, if you look at investments, Europe is investing a huge amount in the US, much more than the reverse.
Than in Europe proper.
No, but also that American companies invest. So, you know, we could just as well say, oh, this is a huge imbalance. You know, we might sell you a little bit more Volkswagens because we don't really have room for these huge trucks that you're producing in America.
Exactly.
But we are investing so much.
And we don't want your bleach chickens.
No, at these things. But, you know, that's a different debate. But this is a problem, a genuine problem that, you know, even the capital we have, we would rather put them in Silicon Valley, just as the Americans, than we put them in Germany or in Denmark or whatever.
I understand. Before we get to the topic of Trump, because you did have some pretty controversial comments with vis-a-vis Trump, but I wanted to address one interesting topic for many of our clients, because obviously when we're in the wealth management space and we're in the capital space, Switzerland comes up a lot as a reference. And in many cases, people would view Switzerland as kind of like the exception. They're not in the European Union, but they do have, my understanding, as many agreements with the EU, free trade, there's freedom of movement. Maybe, could we say to an extent, Switzerland has cracked the code of maybe being the best of both worlds to an extent?
I think Switzerland have found themselves an extremely sweet spot in the sense that they benefit from a lot of the good things from working together without a lot of the obligation that will draw them down. Okay. And yes, in that sense, I would say that, of course, there's always this thing about Switzerland, that it's just a bank secrecy and so on. But no, generally, if you look at Switzerland, they have a very high GDP per capita. They're doing very well. They have, if you go there, most people find it pleasant, a clean, beautiful country. Of course, very, very wealthy and so on. And it works very well for them. And I think this sweet spot of being both looking outside Europe to attract business, to attract investors, to attract activity, and at the same time going along with your neighbors in a practical way. They don't want this one size fits all. They just say, okay, freedom of movement, that sounds nice. Can we negotiate something? Mm-hmm. And I think
on a case by case basis, let's have an agreement.
Let's have an agreement where it makes sense. But you know, we're not going to take this bureaucratical nightmare that you have invented and just implement it one to one. And we don't want to be overruled with our customs. And I think that the key for the Swiss mentality is that they have this very regionalized focus. That it's a very loose federation. You know, mm-hmm. They speak different languages. They have very
and the cantons themselves are very autonomous.
Yeah, that's my point. So therefore for them it's very alien to think, okay, we don't even like the Swiss federal government. Brussels must be even worse. You know,
exactly.
That's thousands of kilometers away.
All right, no, I understand. Okay, interesting. So. Do you see also some European entrepreneurs and capital flocking into Switzerland to a lesser extent in the US, I guess, because of the size of the economy? But is it still a magnet?
A lot of, and also a lot of big companies, as for instance, American companies, they will have their headquarters in Switzerland. You know, so you know, a huge influx of capital, and of course that is also to benefit from this, you know, the best of both worlds. They sort of get what they need in Europe, but on the other hand, they stay outside some of the bureaucracy. But European Union countries have tried a bit of the same. I think Ireland is a good example. They had a very good run. They for instance, had a lot of the tech companies having their European headquarters in Dublin and in Ireland, you know. So
Luxembourg to a lesser extent with the IP box.
Yeah. Luxembourg and capital as well. So yes, you have European Union countries trying to do that, but I think Switzerland is probably a prime example. And then you have, of course, small like Monaco or Liechtenstein or something like that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, now to the topic of Donald Trump. So for people who do not know, can you remind us, you had one very strong comment that made headlines about Donald Trump. Can you give us the, let's say...
The child-friendly version?
The friendly version. Yeah, I like that way of saying it. But can you give us the friendly version on camera?
Yeah, of course. Now, of course, Denmark is a quite small country, but it is United Kingdom. So in principle, when you say the Kingdom of Denmark, it consists of Denmark, the Faroe Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, and the island of Greenland off the coast of North America. And of course, I think for us, as for the Canadians, we feel a little bit offended when Mr. Trump is talking about enlarging American territory. And it is a little bit strange because, you know, I'm on the right side of the political spectrum. I've had plenty of dealings with Republicans in my time in politics. I've been to Washington numerous times. So it's not like I don't define myself as a leftist. I think very few people would do that in general. But of course, it is upsetting for a country like my own of Denmark. You know, we have been allies with the US now for more than 80 years. And what we are seeing now, I think, is symptomatic for this breakdown of transatlantic relations that we are seeing. And to be fair to Trump, because it's not all bad, this is not begun with Trump. I think if we look back historically, and if you're going to write a history of transatlantic relations, I would say that Ronald Reagan is probably the last president who really sort of believed that American values were superior and should be universal in the sense that they should be exported through the world. You know, his speech in Berlin to
tear down, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
You know, that was a belief that American values were superior, or Western values, how we want to define them, were superior to the values of communism in Russia. If you look at sort of this, what we sometimes call a special relationship between the transatlantic relationship, I think Bush Sr. was probably the last president who really saw Europe as his first call. You know, the natural ally, the place you went in America to get your first bridge set before you went global. And since that time, we have had presidents Obama, Biden, Trump, and so on, who has a large emphasis on geopolitics in Asia and China and so on. Of course, we understand why that's important, but also deterioration of transatlantic relations. And I think...
Does that also speak to the decline of Europe? Maybe in Reagan's time, we're talking about the 80s, so maybe Europe was much more relevant then, economically, geopolitically. You still had decolonization was relatively recent.
I would
Hong
say
Kong
that
was still British, Macau was still Portuguese. Like the geopolitical map of the world was different back then.
I would say that most of, when it comes to Europe's economical prospects, it's mostly self-harm. We cannot blame that on the Americans in the sense that, let me give you an example. Denmark is very big on pharmaceuticals. You know, we are selling a lot of medicine, especially to the US, on diabetes and obesity and so on. And you know, European Union just made these new regulations for protections of intellectual property rights within pharmaceuticals. So we decided that we will give 2 years worse patent protection than the US.
Worse patent meaning less, 2 years less?
America has 11, we're going for 9.
Okay.
So even if Novo Nordisk is the largest company in Denmark, by far. So where do they put their R&D now? Do they put it in Copenhagen or in Boston?
In Boston.
In Boston, because those 2 years matters immensely when it comes to
the bottom line and the profits of the shareholders.
And before the pharmaceuticals go into the free market and they can copy it and so on. So these 2 years is where you get the lion's share of your profit, and therefore that is self-harm. Pharmaceuticals is an area where Europe can compete with the US. We have main pharmaceutical companies in Europe. We have them in Switzerland, we have them in France, we have them in Denmark, we have them in other places. But when we don't protect our patents at just an equal playing field with the Americans, of course they'll go to America. They all have daughter companies or production in America.
Subsidiaries.
They can easily move their R&D there, and that is capital going away from us, or investment jobs and so on. And we have done that in so many areas. And I think one of the tragedies we're seeing right now is this so-called Green Deal in Europe. We are simply regulating. For instance, the German car industry, we are basically now giving it away to China. We say, okay, we don't want to produce cars anymore, let the Chinese do that. And if you continue to do that, you don't have an industry.
Yeah, it's ironic because when you travel around the world, I often see bigger, more beautiful, shinier German car dealerships in the US than you would, for example, in Europe proper. So like Mercedes, Audi, BMW, it's almost like you identify them more as America being their home market these days. And there's still the branding of it, like, German engineering behind it. But ultimately German consumers don't appear to be, the top priority for that now.
No, and the other thing is that Europe on cars made a decision to say, okay, we're going to ban the fossil fuel engine completely. That has done one thing, because China is so far ahead when it comes to batteries. That have made all of the German manufacturers and the other, there's also of course Italian and Spanish and so on, Czech car companies, that made all of them 100% dependent on China. So because we're banning something we were very good at, making fossil fuel engines, we made some of the most efficient, well-running.
Even environmentally friendly.
Also that, and you can say that's probably a reason that many of the Formula One companies are based on European car manufacturers, because that is, a lot of innovation is going into the Formula One that is coming back to the consumer down the line, right? But now when you have made this decision, and the other thing is that China is so dominant on the chip production for the car industry, that even you can say, okay, the car is designed in Germany, of course it is. But the battery is Chinese, the computer components Chinese. So basically, you can't say that they are all Chinese cars, because we don't really, in Europe we have fallen so far behind on this, that it's basically just the design phase that we have left in Europe.
Wow, that's very strong. So all you have is designed in Germany, but the rest, the car in of itself is Chinese.
More or less, all the major technological components that you will say is defining for an EV car, that is sort of based in China, made in China.
So, for example, in the U.S., Trump is pretty big on basically going back on the Green New Deal, saying no. He's famous for the statement, drill, baby, drill. Do you think Europe, I mean, obviously Europe is not oil rich like the United States, but Norway is there, not European Union, but I believe Norway's in the EEA. You can correct me, that's the European Economic Area. So there's oil in the North Sea, etc. Do you think Europe would benefit from more drill, baby, drill, from more, policies that would balance out economics and the environment?
You cannot, in the long run, have energy that. First of all, you need energy independence. I think the Americans learned that the hard way. That was why we had this big push for fracking, for more oil excavation in Alaska and other places and so on. And now, from when I grew up, America was an net importer of energy. Now they are huge net exporter, right? In Europe, we did the reverse thing, and it's not only saying, okay, we don't have that many places we can drill, a little bit in the North Sea and so on, but let's just take German nuclear power. Germany had a very, very efficient, large nuclear power base, especially West Germany, good, reliable energy. And then the Green came into government a couple of years ago, and they decided, no, we're going to demand that all the nuclear power plants are shut down. They did that, and we started importing Russian gas. So both for security, and if you really are an environmentalist, you'll say, okay, so you're going from nuclear to gas. Maybe you go from coal to gas if you want to be green, but you're never going the other way. So right now, Germany, which is still the biggest economy in the EU and in Europe, and
one of the biggest in the world.
And still also, of course, a very important industrial base in Europe. Now energy is more expensive. It's less German because it's based on Russian gas. Now also importing liquid gas from America, right? And it's less environmental. So you can say it doesn't serve anything other than making so-called green politicians feel a little bit better about themselves, saying, okay, we won the battle about bad nuclear power, and now we have gas. So Europe needs to take this serious. And for instance, we have a little bit of gas and oil production in Denmark. We decided to say, okay, we're putting an end date to that. I'm saying, no, of course not. If our friends in Europe need oil and gas, it's much better than they buy it from Denmark, Norway, UK, than from, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Russia, or Qatar.
I mean, even if you're going to look outside of Europe, Canada or the US are much more reliable partners. Right?
Yeah, it would be. And I think the problem with North America in this content is that we have pipelines going to Russia. It's just turning
exactly.
on.
Open the faucet.
Open or close. When we are importing American gas, it comes with a huge premium because you have to have it shipped on ships. So of course we are buying a lot. We're also buying from Qatar and
Was this part of the trade deal that was recently negotiated in Scotland? I believe it was Scotland, right?
Yeah. No, this was something that came from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the European Union said, okay, we want less Russian gas, but it's a market, so where you have to buy it somewhere, and therefore we had to, of course, start diversifying, and there the American gas came in. I think it will increase because the European Commission has now a principled opinion that we should outphase Russian gas and oil completely, and that will mean that we have to buy more gas for a considerable future from from Turkey, from the Gulf states, but also from North America.
Okay. So to end on this note, I wanted to ask you, obviously, as I just referenced, there were some pretty, I would say, tough back and forth negotiations with President Donald Trump recently. There was a summit in Scotland. Famously, there was this big EU-US trade deal. What is your opinion on the deal? How do you see US-EU relations moving forward?
As I said, I think this is there's an undercurrent here that for many years have drawn Europe and US away from each other, regardless whether you have Republican or Democratic presidents. So that I think is difficult to reverse because American focus now is on Asia. It is on. When I go to the US, both Democrats and Republicans that we speak to, they say China, China, China. Their agenda is China first, China second, China third, and then we can maybe talk about something else. But we have to get through.
And then China. Mexico, and then
then how we take back Canada and so on. But that is basically their agenda, right? And I think in Europe we have not really taken any. There's some Europeans who say, we want to be the middle of the road. China here, America there, both bad. We want to be the census in the middle. There are some who are saying, let's keep the transatlantic, let's try to stand together, let's try to, but Europe is divided on that. So that's the one obstacle, I would say. And on the other side of things, it is, I think, generally tariffs are a bad thing. I think competition is healthy as long as it's on a level playing field, as long as you're not cheating with state subsidies and stuff like that. But free trade have gotten a very bad rap. I think the problem was we won the Cold War, and we won. We even have a sort of a market economy in China. They're basing even though it's a communist economy, they're basing it on market
corporatist level.
Yeah, in a way, they acknowledge that's better than 5-year plans and big leap forward and so on. So they have sort of taken that in. But since we sort of won that fight on the sort of
when the Iron Curtain came down,
we just forgot to defend free trade, and therefore free trade in many electorates, not only in America where Trump clearly has a core connection with some of his voters on this question of tariffs, but also in Europe. People are afraid of competition. They get afraid when they don't see job security, when they don't see prosperity for the children, for the next generation. So we have failed in many ways on this political agenda of free trade, and that is why we are seeing now tariffs returning into the economy. I think it's going to be bad for America. I think it's going to be bad for Europe. I think it's generally going to be bad for the world. But I think that it is a neglect of fighting this fight on why free trade matters that have resolved in this, because it is popular with a huge part of the electorate. Not only in America, you find the same tendencies in France, Italy, Spain.
Germany recently.
Germany as well. Yeah. So and it's sort of not even a left-right thing anymore. You can find it on the right, you can find it on the left. So basically, I think we are going to a phase now, 10, 15 years, where tariffs are going to be something that we have to navigate in and around. But
so almost like going back to more of a protectionist type general scenario.
But on the other hand, we are so globalized now in the world that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do it. Many in Europe say, we are going to solve Russia-Ukraine war by sanction. You cannot, because we don't control trade anymore in the West. So, if you want to sanction Russia, I had journalists call me the other day, we have sanctioned the import of plywood from Russia. And he called me and said, do you know where Denmark now is buying most of its plywood? I said, no. United Arab Emirates. I said, that's very strange, because I didn't think they had huge forests in the United Arab Emirates to make plywood.
Suddenly.
And of course, what is happening is that the exact decline we've had in import of Russian plywood has just now been resolved through the United Arab Emirates. We are seeing a lot of these Eurasian states suddenly having a huge export to Europe they never had before. And of course, this is just Russian goods going that way around.
But I guess it makes them more expensive, and ultimately the European consumer then gets hurt.
There is a premium on it, but it's not, I think, not for Trump, not for Putin, not for EU. It's not possible to hinder the free flow of goods and services, but the consumer is going to pay a premium for bad politics.
Got it. Well, on that note, and in support of free trade and the free movement of capital and people around the world, I thank everyone for watching. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.